Thank you everybody for being here tonight. As you may or may not know, for the last number of months, Jackie and her team has been putting together these amazing workshops for our volunteers and for our community to help our community, first of all, find a way to work through COVID, but also to continue to develop their professional development. So Jackie has single-handedly on her own put these workshops together with some fabulous people in our community and beyond. That's the beauty of Zoom or Teams, is that we can tap into resources all over the province, all over the country, all over the world. And that's exactly what Jackie has done. Every year, Jackie hosts these workshops. As a result of COVID, we've been able to reach people all over the province, which has been fantastic. So I thank you all for being here today, this Pink Shirt Day, which is my pink shirt that I've got on today. So recognizing anti-bullying, thanks to the Boys and Girls Club and the United Way. So tonight you guys have got what's in store for you is an amazing workshop. And this is, I think it's the first of what, 4 that you have done already. And we've got a couple of more that are coming up. So please keep an eye out on social media if you want to sign up for other workshops. Just real quickly, because you didn't sign on to hear me, for those of you that may not be as familiar about Youth Diversion, we've been around for about 46 years, primarily supporting children and youth, helping them overcome challenges. We have 7 programs and services that are designed to meet young people where they're at. So whether it's justice or substance use or educational needs, whether it's being connected to positive adult role models in the community, if it's helping young people overcome challenges in education or conflict within education, a restorative approach to solving issues, to the work that Jackie does, which is connecting volunteers to our agency. All of you folks have contributed to our agency being able to provide young people with mentors, with supports through schools, helping young people overcome challenges with criminal behavior. These are some of the things that we have our volunteers do on a daily basis. I mean, they contribute for us anywhere between 4,000 to 8,000 hours a year, which is almost the equivalent of 2 full-time positions. And we can't do the work that we do without you folks. So part of what we try to do to give back to you is to offer these really worthwhile workshops to help you improve your ability to support our agency and other youth-serving agencies within our community, within our province, and in our country. So whether you're volunteering with us as a mentor or through Rebound, or some of the administrative stuff that we do, our staff are always eager to work with volunteers and to support volunteers and ensure that their contribution to our community means a lot and is worthwhile. So Youth Diversion, I mean, we've been around for 46 years. We have 20 staff, 7 programs, whether it's outreach, mentoring, our classroom, youth justice, substance use, outreach, intersections. These are just some of the programs that we've put together to support young people and helping them overcome challenges. So without further ado, what I'd like to be able to offer you folks is this night to enjoy this workshop and be aware of other workshops that are coming up thanks to the work that Jackie and her team has done. And I wish you all the best, and I hope that tonight's workshop has been as informative as all the other ones have been, because we've had some really great feedback, and really look forward to the folks tonight and what they have to share and what they have to say. So thank you again for being here, and I'll turn it back over to Jackie.
Great, thank you, Sean. I appreciate it. So we're gonna start. Just a few keynote things to tell you. We're hoping everybody's we're gonna mute everyone. And if you have any questions, if you can put it in the chat box, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. As we start the presentation, Kat and Samara are gonna tell you guys how the workshop's gonna run, because they're the ones who are gonna lead us through the workshop. And if you would like a certificate at the end, if you'd like a certificate, Just make sure that you put your name the way you want it on your certificate, your email address in the chat box so that I can send it off to you. And you'll probably get it in about a week's time. Also, this presentation will be recorded, and you will be able to go on our Youth Diversion Facebook page and get the recording. And also, we're happy to share the slides with you. So if you've missed it, if you missed anything tonight, you can always capture it later. What else? Our next workshop is going to be next Thursday. I don't know why I made it that close, but it's next Thursday. It's on the balancing app, managing time and your priorities. So make sure we've sent out the invitations already. And if you haven't gotten one as yet, just send me a quick email. We'll make sure that we get you on the list. I'm gonna send it over now to, actually, before I send it over, I'm gonna tell you a little bit about Samara and Catherine. So Samara Lejam is a third-year political student at Queen's. From a young age, Samara has had a passion for advocacy on issues of social justice and oppression. Working with the Student Experience Office, Samara facilitates and leads transform training for hundreds of student leaders. She is passionate about using education and policy change to improve the student experience for marginalized students at Queen's. Samara is involved in equity work and student governance, currently serving as a Deputy of Education in the Social Issues Commission and the Director of Student Research Affairs for the Arts and Science undergraduate study. And then we've got Catherine. Catherine is a fourth-year student at Queen's University pursuing a bachelor's degree in global development studies. She holds a diverse pool of experiences in communication, public speaking, compensation, research, and service. Catherine is one of the youngest individuals, youngest individual recipients of a United Way Ottawa Community Builders Award for her community service and advocacy for the support of marginalized youth and the greater investment to see their academic success. Moreover, in her school community, she is an active advocate for an anti-racism approach, inclusive, equity, and respect. Currently, she serves as the president of the Queen's Black Academic Society. So I'm going to turn it over to Catherine and Samara, and they are going to take it from here. So welcome and thank you guys for all the hard work that you've put into your presentation tonight. So over to you, Catherine.
Hello, everybody. I'm so happy to see so many people present for this workshop. Thank you so much, Jackie, for the introduction. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for this equity workshop. Before we begin, I just wanted to let everybody know that some of the concepts that we'll be covering can seem very daunting. And so I want people to come into this workshop feeling like understanding to be kind to yourself. This is a learning process. Nobody expects you to know all of these things, and we are meant to be learning together, and we hope that we can foster an environment which allows us to do this. So my name is Catherine Haba.
And my name is Samara Lejam.
And we're going to go through the training outline for today. So we have a lot of concepts that we'll be covering today, like I mentioned, and at first sight, the connection between these topics may not be apparent. However, I encourage you to think about them not only conceptually, but also try to reflect on how these apply to you. We encourage interaction as well through the presentation. And for this reason, we encourage people to use the chat function and different reaction buttons as well. Questions seeking to clarify concepts that we cover in the slides can be shared through the chat function throughout the presentation, and we'll be addressing them. But more general questions will be answered towards the ending portion of our presentation. We will also be sharing a link in the chat, and let me actually do that right now, to a Padlet, which is an interactive tool which allows us to pull our thoughts together as a community. And so as the presentation goes on, you can have a tab open with this Padlet where as things come to your head, if you have any questions or just ideas and thoughts, you can put them on here anonymously, And at the end, when we're doing the Q&A, we'll also put up the Padlet and see what we have all contributed throughout the presentation. So here's the link I just dropped. And so we can move on.
So now I would like to start with the land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that I am located on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. Being at Queens and living in Kingston, we live in one of the earliest colonially settled regions in Canada. As someone who is born in what is now known as Canada, I want to recognize my positionality and the privileges that I have as a settler. And as the child of reaching refugees who were displaced by the aftermath of colonization in Africa, I also want to recognize the universal struggle and detriments of colonization that have affected my family on the other side of the world. Whether it's across Canada and globally, the process of colonization is ongoing, and we all have the responsibility to help remedy the institutional, cultural ramifications today. In our lives, we must commit to fighting anti-Indigenous oppression and biases in our country, institutions, communities, and most importantly, when we find this bias within ourselves. So today, we're going to honor this land's Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee roots and the history of Indigenous people across Turtle Island. And I want to encourage you to, wherever you are, do some research and reflect on your own position and positionality and privilege on this land so that we can move past words and towards tangible action and reconciliation. So now we can move on to our community agreements. These are just some rules that we're going to establish to make sure that this is a safe space where we can hold each other accountable. And if you have any suggestions or if anybody wants to add any, please feel free to add. But the first one is be present. While we're here, please pay attention and to engage as much as you can, whether it's, as Catherine said, using the Padlet or the chat function. If you don't want to mute yourselves and talk, just sort of share whatever you feel comfortable sharing. Step up and step back. So balancing sharing with listening. Well, we want you to engage. We also want you to step back and listen to what other people are sharing. Notice power dynamics. This is something that we'll be talking a lot about throughout the training, but being conscious of your identity and how that shapes your opinions and views and how you view the material today. Share your own experiences. Try to use I statements and not speak on the experiences of others. And assume that people have good intentions. If you want to challenge an idea or topic, try to challenge the topic that's been shared or the idea that's been shared and not the person sharing it, just assuming that we're all trying our best. And holding each other accountable, making sure that this is a safe space. Our priority here is to learn, and learning can be done best when we are comfortable. So making sure that we will all hold each other accountable while we're doing this training.
That said, we're going to be delving into the first topic, which is privilege. So on a basic level, privilege can be understood as something that a given person or group can have that is absent within other groups or often systematically denied to another group based on social hierarchies that are at play. So essentially, where others can face a lack of privilege and are unable to exist and navigate through space, someone who has privilege may be able to engage with that space a lot easier. So privilege does have an impact on the ways people experience not only circumstances, but also places. Again, sorry, could we go back? Yes. So the ways in which this can express itself, for example, can be someone can find a space to be difficult or exclusive, while another person can have no issue with that same space because they feel included. It is an important point also to recognize that privilege can be as intersectional as our identities. So because we derive certain privileges from aspects of our lives and the things that may be normalized or acceptable to society, it is important also to understand that privilege works in a very complex way. So the next point also to that is the fact that privilege and oppression are not mutually exclusive. Within a person's experience, these two things can be coexist. So where you may feel privilege because of a certain aspect of your life, you may also feel be oppressed in other ways. So we'll talk about some types of privileges. So we have able-bodied privilege, which can come from the fact that we do not have a physical disability or any kind of disabilities that can render certain things more difficult to us. Cisgender privilege, which comes from an alignment with our biological sex assignment and the gender identity with which we most comfortably experience life in. There's heterosexual privilege. There's Christian privilege, which discusses the ways in which our faith and the ways society and the assumptions that are made about our faith are perceived. There's class privilege, as well as white privilege or privileges that are associated to our race. So next we'll be doing a little exercise where I want everybody to take a look at these different scenarios, and based on the privileges that were mentioned in the last slide, try to go through them and kind of associate within in your mind which privilege can be at play in the circumstance. So for example, when we talk about you don't have to worry about stairs and hills when walking around campus, what kind of privilege does that resonates in your mind in terms of what we discussed? And so I'm just gonna take a moment and wait and let you guys do that. Also, if you do want to share, you can share in the chat function. And then afterwards, we'll be posting the answers before we move to the next slide. I see a few comments, so I'm really happy people are able to pick these different privileges out. I guess hopefully we've been able to go through them and you've been able to at least identify a few. If we could click again just to show the answers and just so we can reflect on which ones we were more easily able to identify. I think what is important in this exercise also is that certain ones probably came to us more naturally and we were able to identify them more naturally than others. And so in the same way, when we exist, certain privileges will be able to identify certain privileges more easily than others. So the next slide, please.
Great, so now we're going to talk about positionality, which is kind of finding the context of our identity. And this is really important when doing equity work, just to recognize our privileges and oppressions and the way that they affect how we view, kind of as was demonstrated in the last example, how we view the world. So I think recognizing your privilege is great for being able to take action and hold yourself accountable, and recognizing your oppression is really great for building community and being able to find the supports and resources that you might not have really known that you needed. And as we sort of talked about how intersectional privilege is, I just want everybody to take a couple minutes and either open a notepad or a doc on their computer and just go through this wheel that I like to call the wheel of privilege and oppression. This was included in LEAD Include Transform training. And I just want everybody to go through the wheel and write out all of the aspects of identity that they feel apply to themselves. And I find that when people go through this, they usually find a lot of aspects of their identity that they didn't really realize were areas that either gave them privilege or that caused them to be oppressed. So just take 1 or 2 minutes to go through this, please.
We also encourage you to take screenshot if you want to make it easier. And this is also something that you'll be able to find again on the material that will be shared afterwards.
Okay, great. We could probably move on for now, but if anybody wants to screenshot and refer to this chart later, feel free to do that.
Okay. So we've talked about privilege and we've talked about positionality, which is also something that helps us to situate ourselves in terms of the ways that we may feel privilege and the ways in which we may experience oppression. So what is oppression? Sorry. Oppression is a group's use of power and privilege to disempower and marginalize another group. A lot of times this can be done either in explicit ways or in implicit ways. So why does oppression happen and why do people feel oppression? So this can be understood as a fundamental difference between the group that is being oppressed and the group or institution that is the cause of this oppression. Could be an attempt to gain more power or maintain a power um, away from a certain group. And it is important for us to also look at the ways the oppression can be done intentionally or unintentionally. So intentionally in meaning that oftentimes when we see or we hear about a group being oppressed, um, in the historical ways that that group has been oppressed, it can be very clear that this was done in intentional ways. So when we talk about things like slavery or talk about colonization, these are examples that people can all look at and understand as being like an intentional and also explicit ways of oppression. And other ways of unintentional oppression can be in the space that you as a person can occupy within your privilege, which hampers the ability of someone else to be able to exist or experience empowerment. Okay. Okay, thank you, Samara, for answering that question. So next.
Yeah, so now we're going to be talking about implicit biases, which is something that maybe people have heard before, but I'll try to give a good intro. So it's essentially biases are the assumptions and associations that cause biases in our opinions and perceptions of people. So we were all socialized the same in terms of stereotypes and biases. From the minute we're born, we can't help but being ingrained and absorbing the media that we are surrounded with. And while we absorb this, we also absorb the stereotypes and biases that are prevalent in that society. And they show themselves not always through our actions and our identity, but more through the small split-second assumptions that we make about people when we meet them. For example, how likely we are to perceive somebody as dangerous or as smart or as leader versus too loud. And these biases are so strong that they're often internalized by people of color and other minority groups who experience them as well. So there's a few notes about implicit bias. Firstly, having implicit bias doesn't necessarily mean that you're racist. It can mean it if you sort of are aware of your implicit bias and don't do anything about it. A lot of people talk about subconscious biases, but when they're no longer subconscious, when you're aware of them and you don't do anything about it, it's a bit more willful. So that's an important note. Our implicit biases might not reflect our declared beliefs or actions. So even if you feel like you are a progressive person or you're very outspoken or knowledgeable about social issues, you can still have subconscious assumptions and biases that are different. And yeah, as we said, they're not always intentional. As Kat said, oppression is very often unintentional and not explicit. And it just because we have been socialized with these biases, it doesn't mean that there's nothing we could do about them. Our brains are malleable, and we can definitely train ourselves to have a more open outlook of the world and each other. So now we're going to watch a video from Italy, and it just talks with some kids and kind of reveals their implicit biases. Are people able to hear the sound?
Okay, so apparently people aren't hearing the sound. I'm not hearing it either. Could we restart the video and maybe see if it's um, in terms of like who's screen sharing, if they can put the volume up? Maybe try that.
Quale bambola è nera? Quale delle due è bella?
Questa.
Qual è quella bella? Qual è quella brutta? E qual è quella buona? Quale è cattiva? Qual è buona?
Lei.
Perché è buona?
Perché ha gli occhi celesti.
Quale è cattiva? Perché è cattiva?
Perché è tutto nero.
E qual è la bambola che ti somiglia di più? Quale bambola è nera?
Mi ha offeso.
Chi?
Tu.
Perché?
Perché mi hai chiamato nero.
Perché ti ho offeso?
Mi offendi perché altri bambini mi hanno offeso con cattiveria.
No, io non ho usato nessuna cattiveria.
Quello mi sta guardando storto.
Okay, great. Thanks for watching. And if you want to share any reactions or comments on the Padlet and the chat, feel free, because that's definitely a very poignant video. And it just sort of demonstrates that with implicit bias, we don't really need to be told that, for example, in this context, white means pretty. It's while we're not sort of sat down and told that, we're kind of demonstrated that through the beauty industry and television and media in so many ways that even from a very young age, kids can absorb this and display it. So we can move on to the next slide. So just talking a bit about the effects of implicit bias and how sort of prevalent the aftermath is in our society. So it is definitely present in different institutions. Firstly, in healthcare, people of color often don't get prescribed medication as much, especially painkillers. And when surveyed medical students in the States, there have been lots of reports where they often believe lots of misconceptions about different races. Some that were mentioned were that a lot of students feel that Black people have less sensitive nerve endings and feel less pain, or have thicker skin and things like that, that are sort of obviously not true, but have detrimental effects when doctors and healthcare professionals believe that. Discriminations within schools, people of color and students of color are much more likely to get suspended and expelled than other students. Unequal sentencing in the justice system. Here again, it's not like the laws are different for different groups, but it's the interpretation of the law and our biases coming through the different people in the system. People with foreign names not getting as many callbacks and applying for jobs. Lots of survey has showed that that's a disadvantage for people. And internalized racism, as we saw in that video, internalizing it and having sort of problems with insecurity, imposter syndrome, where even when you achieve success, when you don't see people that are successful that look like you, it's hard to sort of be comfortable being successful. And stereotype threat, which is actually a phenomenon where that just shows how negative stereotypes can affect you. In the States, they gave two groups of African-American students intelligence tests, and they told one group that it was an intelligence test, the other, they didn't tell them it was an intelligence test. And the group who believed it was an intelligence test did worse because of internalizing stereotypes about the Black intelligence or the lack thereof, which definitely is a big problem.
Yes, so when we talk about implicit bias and the ways they can be internalized and reflected within and become common practices on which people operate on, another important concept that associates itself to this are monolithic narratives. So this talks about the idea that an over, sorry, it relies on an over reliance on race being a central determinant of attitude, experiences, etc. So understanding a person based on a single element of their identity in which they are grouped with others that may have that shared identity. And so the ways in which we can most commonly see this is, for example, the kind of stereotypes or narratives that are told about members of the Black community as a whole, and that understanding that people don't necessarily exist as an individual, but they are seen as having traits or understood as being part of that bigger group. So it is important to recognize the heterogeneity within racial groups. So understanding the diversity within racial groups, within different identities even, and not working on those assumptions which tend to group people and erase the other elements of their identities and their experiences. So individual experiences, gender, sexuality, and other areas of our identity are important in breaking down monolithic narratives. Why are they important? Because they undermine racial stereotypes and narratives. When we are looking at a person as a whole and their different identities, as well as their experiences, then it becomes much harder to understand them within a specific stereotype and how they conform or do not conform to this stereotype. Another point, it opens up our understanding of experiences and needs. So looking at people not only within one element of their identity, but looking at the scope of the person that they are, gives a greater understanding of the ways that they experience things, again, experience things like privilege in certain areas, but oppression in others, as well as their needs in terms of empowerment, etc. It also helps like an active process of unlearning. So adopting this mindset of not only looking at one area helps us unlearn these things that we've been taught about certain groups and see them as being false. And so now we're going to be talking about savior complex. So in the chat, there was a question, and I hope the person doesn't mind. There was a question that was talking previously about oppression and the ways we spoke about how oppression can sometimes be intentional and unintentional. And so the person had mentioned looking at the value and intention. So if the person had a good intention, which led to an unintended negative result, is that worse or better? And so also understanding that is it better to not help at all or to help in the ways that we can. And so, first of all, I wanted to explain what savior complex is. It's a situation that arises when someone engages in helping a community or group that is not their own in a self-serving way or without an account for power dynamics. And so, although a lot of times this is like well-meaning, the savior complex can be detrimental to the success of the community and the group receiving the help or the saving. And oftentimes, people who exhibit a savior complex do not know it themselves because they have very much that good intention of wanting to help and support. And I think what is important here is to understand that when we are engaging in helping or interacting with communities which may be foreign to us or in which we are not directly situated in, it is important to put at the forefront the needs of that community. So despite how well intentioned we are, we have to make sure that our intentions are not dictating what we think is being needed or what we think should be the action that is taken in a circumstance, but rather always referring back to that community or the person that you're trying to help to find out the ways in which you can help. And I think when we think of allyship as well, this is a great way to be able to practice a positive kind of allyship that actually supports the groups that you're working for by, although it's hard and sometimes you feel like you know and understand the needs, it does not harm to just ask, what can I do? And I think in that way, we can avoid the situation where, yes, I want to help. Is it better if I don't help at all because I could end up messing up? But rather, you know what is needed of you. And even when you, let's say, have been engaging in a kind of savior complex and you finally realize that, but some of the work or the damage has been done, I think it's important to take a step back and start putting at the forefront the needs of that community and having an open line of communication, which allows for that. I think someone mentioned there's a lot of examples of the white savior complex in media, like The Blind Side and The Help. Yes, those are examples. And I think the most common example also that we can refer to is voluntourism, where some people may go into a community abroad and want to help and build a school or help build a well or etc. But oftentimes, depending on the situation that's happening, they're going with certain agencies or even there is a lack of communication that happens between the group that is being helped and the group that is providing that help. Whereas there is no understanding of the duration and the actual needs that need to be met. And so, yes, I was mentioning, so how can the savior complex be detrimental to the success of the community? If we click, we'll see the answers that pop up. So one, it perpetuates a power imbalance. So when we are not aware of our own positionality and what we're coming into, as well as the kind of power imbalances that can happen, especially if you're, let's say, in a position of power within a certain organization and you're coming into a group that is reliant or accepting of this help, there is a power imbalance there that needs to be acknowledged in order to be able to have a positive interaction. It can create barriers in communication. If you feel like you already know what a community needs, there is most likely not going to be any kind of communication in terms of reaffirming, confirming, or even trying to change this and correcting your perspective. And then also they do little in order to resolve issues effectively. Again, when you're not informed properly and you're not working on the basis of serving that community, let's say, any kind of things that are put forward, despite how good and how well-meaning they are, it might not help in the long term that community and address the issue at hand.
Hey, thank you. That was such an important topic. So now we're going to talk about the differences between equality, equity, and inclusion. These are different social justice terms used in equity work, and they have the same goal, but are different examples of how the methodology within equity can vary. So this is a popular graphic that some might have seen before. In the first part all the way to the left, that's a picture of equality, where everybody gets the same resources regardless of their individual needs. And the problem with this is while everybody's getting resources, it doesn't fully help everyone. It doesn't take into account individuality or intersectionality. The second picture in the middle is equity, where everybody gets the supports they need. And this is much better. We've seen this a lot more with focused resources, and they're definitely great to see. However, in the last picture, we see inclusion. The difference is that it's more of a sustainable action than just sort of having equitable resources. When you're having an inclusive society, you're removing the causes of inequity and addressing the barriers that are making that society unacceptable or inaccessible. And this is the most sustainable way to create change, where in the middle you have people who, while they are able to see the soccer game, they're still forced to rely on those resources, where in an inclusive society nobody has to rely on resources to be able to live. Now we're going to be talking a bit about power. So throughout this training, we hope that you learned a lot about equity concepts that hopefully will help you in the work that you do with youth diversion and also just in life. And I want to talk a bit about what you can do with that power now that you sort of recognize your role within equity and having a purpose within equity. There's a lot of different types of power that we have and action that we can take. Firstly, we have power over others. This is sort of our social power. We have the power to influence others through being a role model in our actions and also through intervening and stopping things when we see them happen and being an active bystander. We have the power to, this is the power of action. We have the power to do, the power to organize, the power to fight for change, and just sort of that autonomy. We have the power with, so that's our collective ability to organize. This is really important within equity because we are so much more powerful together, and really building community is really important to get anything done. And then the power within, which is something that I think people don't think about as often. It's our autonomy and the control over ourselves for our own decision making. People often focus equity efforts on others, on educating others and helping others, but we sometimes forget to focus our efforts on ourselves, on helping ourselves unlearn and further exploring our identity and how that sort of intersects with other oppressions and privileges.
Yeah, and someone was just mentioning how these concepts align with restorative practices, which thank you very much for making that connection. So now we're going to talk about some resources and tips and strategies. So I'm just going to take a moment actually to share in the group chat a link to a Google Docs that's going to have more general resources that are available to everyone. And within them also, it brings you to other pages that have so many more, so that this process of education that and learning that we've started here today or continued here today can continue further. So if we have any Queen's students here, some resources in order to continue to learn more about EDII, so equity, diversity, inclusion, and such can be the Lead, Include, Transform training, which is available. We also have the Kairos blanket exercise, which is something that is available to all. And I would really encourage people to look into it because the research I did was so cool on it. We have Social Issues Commission. So some schools and different organizations have these social issues commissions, or sometimes it can be under like a human, like human resources, human rights. So whatever the name may take form in your organization, we'd encourage you to look into that and find out if there is. There is also Black student and community groups that are present. So going to those groups, not in order to like extract information from them, but really coming as an open an active learner that's willing to watch and learn, and also ask when the time comes what you can do to help and stand in solidarity. And there's also abolisheverything.org, which has really amazing workshops and trainings each week that have a focus on like decolonization and anti-Black racism. So I definitely encourage you to go and look at that. And just some parting thoughts. When you are engaged in this, know when to step back and listen, and when to step in and speak out. So again, it's great to be an advocate, to be there, but it's also great to understand when it's time to learn, so that you can more better help people afterwards. So recognize your positionality, and the power dynamics at play when you are doing equity work. Within ourselves already, there can be so many power dynamics when we have over like different areas of our life which give us privilege, but then also we're oppressed in other areas. So there's such complexity within ourselves. So it's important to also understand these power dynamics when we are working outwardly with others. Being anti-racist, anti-ableist, anti-homophobic, and etc. Be fighting, so anti-transphobic as well, sorry, is about fighting injustice whenever you see it around you, and most importantly, when you find it within yourself. So it's not always about seeing it outside, but also taking that moment to reflect inwardly and again, challenge those biases that you may have taken and like through socialization, and recognizing that supporting and standing for different groups is not marginalizing yourself or taking away from your privilege, but rather making it more inclusive and empowering others to be, to have full existences and be able to have access to opportunities that you currently have. And then to be radical looks at things from the root. So not just looking at short-term solutions, but looking at the different isms and structures that are part of the issue, that create this issue. And the issues are often side effects of bigger things that have been brewing for years, and understanding also that things are not gonna get changed in one day. And it's not your responsibility either to fix everything, and understanding that there's people that were working before you, there's people that are working with you right now, and there will be people that will work after you to continue to challenge these structures. And so that's the end of our presentation, and we're going to be going into the question period. If anybody has any, before we dive into a discussion also about how we can be more positive and active supporters within our community. So feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question within the chat or something that you want us to talk about. I know that it was a lot of information that came at you really quickly, but you guys have been really good troopers, and I really appreciate all the interaction that's been happening. And I think also we'll try to put up the Padlet and see if there's been anything that people were writing on that. But yeah, feel free to talk. Actually, maybe to help the conversation start, Cheyenne, if I could share my screen just so I can put up the Padlet and we can maybe address some of the points that were written on there just to get some of the conversation started, and maybe some people questions will come to mind. Again, this is a safe space and also a judgment-free zone, and it's really just about educating ourselves. And we are by no means experts, and our process also includes learning. So as we do these things, we're learning ourselves. And so we encourage you and supporting us, and let's learn together.
Yeah, and I just want to say also that if you want to submit questions anonymously or like not through the Padlet/chat, you can send them privately to Kat or me.
Yeah. Okay, we have some good stuff. This is a good number. So we have, thank you both for formative presentation. It's so important to continue talking about this in our community. Oh, thank you so much. Well, there's a lot of thank yous.
Yeah, this is such a positive Padlet.
Positive. Behavior complex is very interesting to me because while people are trying to help, they may actually be doing more harm. Yes. When can various forms of privilege be used to help minorities, if ever? Yeah, Samara, did you want to take it away? I could also talk about this. I feel like I've been talking a lot.
I feel like I have to think on that one a bit more, actually, if you want to
Um,
this part.
yeah, so again, I think when you're able to recognize that privilege that you have, and also recognize where someone else there's a lack of that privilege. I think often we think of privilege as being the opposite of oppression, which is the case, but not really the case. The opposite of oppression is just to live, freedom, just existence. And so when you have that heightened level of freedom where you actually have privilege that can turn into power, it's important not just to go around kind of waving this around, but um, learning to inform yourself on how, one, your privilege itself may have contributed to someone's oppression, but then also speaking to whatever community that you want to support about the ways in which you can support them, and talking about your privilege in a very candid way, um, and continuously trying to use that voice that may be listened to more to be able to do this. And this doesn't necessarily mean be like leading causes, but it can be just in your day to day. If you understand that you have, for example, white privilege, and rooted within how other marginalized communities have been treated because of that, the simple way that you could use your privilege is literally making more of a practice of talking to family members, talking to friends, having conversations that are candid, and bringing these up where necessarily you don't have to think about this day to day, but you're engaging others and thinking about the ways they act and interact, and may be complicit in this work that is happening without knowing it.
Yeah, that's like that's a really interesting question, definitely. But even just having privilege, like, and sort of being in spaces or having sort of leadership positions in spaces where you feel comfortable because you have privilege, using that comfortableness or that position of leadership to lift up other communities and lift up other voices, and regardless of what your identity is, everybody can be involved in equity work. And for some people who are more privileged, it might be easier too. So really using that to do good.
Mhm. Oh, I love it. Some people are are talking about certain things that we mentioned and how they appreciate that, and also, yeah, how it was eye-opening to go through that wheel and recognize some of the things that they never experienced because of their identity. The more we talk about EDI, the more we could normalize the situation. Okay, sorry, I'll let that thought finish. Yeah, are there anything in the chat? Let me see. Any questions maybe that we can discuss? Yes, Samantha, EDI is equity, diversity, inclusion, but EDII, where the second I includes indigeneity. No, don't worry about saying the wrong thing or offending people. Yeah, that's another way also to recognize something that you don't necessarily think about. And also, somebody had mentioned this to me and talking about allyship and like solidarity. And it was the idea of continuing this even when the group you're advocating for is not in the room, especially when they're not in the room. So making sure that your voice isn't going over them, but where their voice is absent, your voice is speaking loudly to make sure that that voice is brought into the space. And I found that really nice. So it's not only about having a strong supportive voice alongside the communities that you want to work with, but also when they are not around and when you have that opportunity and you have that privilege, advocating for their presence, especially if you feel like it is needed, and especially if you understand that this is something that they're advocating for as well.
There's a question that came in the chat that I don't know if maybe Kat can't see because you're sharing your screen. But as a white male, I do worry about saying the wrong thing or offending people. How does this intersect with the general freedom to like what we like, who we like, and how we like, as a basic concept of freedoms and rights in a place like 21st century Canada, as a merely coincidental example? Yeah, that's a great question. And I feel like that's something that a lot of people sort of get confused with because it is a thin line. And you obviously everybody can like what and who they like and not like what or who they don't. I think that it's just when you don't like somebody because of an aspect of their identity, you cannot like somebody, but when you don't like somebody because of their race or because of their religion, that's obviously problematic. And because of things like implicit bias, I think that we often don't realize how often our opinions of people are related to our subconscious views or internalized assumptions based off of their gender or race or whatnot. I saw a TikTok, this isn't really like academic research, but I saw a TikTok recently that asked everybody, who is a celebrity that you don't like just for no reason? Like you can't really tell, there's just something that bothers you about them. And in the comments, everybody, out of all the listed answers, significantly more, most of them were women. And it was just really interesting that people often, when people often don't like somebody for a reason that they can't really tell, they're often women or minorities. And so there's sort of something to definitely look at and consider more because of things like implicit biases and how our societies isms and oppressions can be internalized. So we might, while we think we might just not like something, there's sort of more, there might be more of a reason there than we think, is sort of what I want to say. And if Kat has anything else to add.
Yeah, and I think that goes even further when like it's one thing not to like something, but it's another to be indifferent to that person, and to be indifferent to the ways that person like. And when we even think of the ways people experience oppression, you can say that, oh, you don't like a decision someone has made or like a part of their identity, but to be indifferent to the ways in which they are being persecuted because of that, that goes far beyond. And you need to, and like there needs to be a questioning, and I think this is even an activity that we can do walking away from here, just thinking of like, okay, what do I like, what do I not like, and then just writing it down and just trying to, even if it's one of them, just trying to work out what are some of the assumptions or one of the things that just come to your mind, and you may not recognize them even as assumptions, but you think there's truth. But going through that exercise, and knowing, because it becomes very hard, not even hard, it becomes very not, I don't want to say problematic, but it's just terrible when the humanity of that person beyond you not liking that person, you become indifferent to the person's humanity and no longer recognize it or even defending that.
Yeah, definitely. Somebody just said in the Padlet, sometimes when I find myself thinking negatively about individuals, I have to take a step back and understand where those thoughts are coming from. And yeah, Kat was sort of talking about it. And it's definitely true. Like when we think sort of like, for example, when I have a woman in my life who I think is kind of like rude or rubs me the wrong way, I kind of think, would I think this of her if she was a guy, for example? And it just kind of shows that people's identities do affect the way that we view them. They do affect what we expect from them and what we're willing to let slide and things like that. So yeah, but that's definitely a great point and a great discussion.
And I don't know about you guys, but they're like in the process of like doing advocacy work, there's been a lot of times where I've had to take some step back and just be like, and do that same exercise of like, okay, I don't like this person. Why do I not like them? Or like someone just rubs me the wrong way. And when I have realized that a lot of it is maybe attached to certain assumptions or like implicit bias I have, there's this initial shame or even like denial that tries to like penetrate. And it's something that I've become, and I've had to really work hard at pushing away, not being defensive about it, because it's one of the, like, if you're defensive about it, there's nothing that's going to change. You're going to continue to have these, yes, you've done this revelation that you have implicit biases, but from that point, once you are no longer ignorant and that veil of ignorance has been lifted, everything that you do and the way that you behave and like address that is what becomes important. So when we think about that intent, or like when you wanted to do good, or you necessarily had you had an ignorance that didn't allow you to understand the ways in which your actions were being received, it's important once you've recognized that, what are you going to do about it? And I think it's that step, and also just not trying to overhaul everything just in one go, because that will become very draining or even frustrating. But rather just knowing that it's a commitment of being like, of systematically looking at these implicit biases and also like checking in on yourself and the things that you're thinking. How do you recommend approaching family members? Oh. Okay, somebody said, how do you start a discussion about these topics with people who may become, ooh. Samara, do you have any tips in terms of the trainings that you've led? Has something worked or been I don't know, a key go-to?
I mean, yeah, it's like people aren't often defensive, luckily, although dismissive, definitely. And it's tough. I would say that definitely sort of centering it from an unlearning perspective and trying to understand what their beliefs are and why. When people are just like, people sort of often don't like to consider other perspectives outside of their own. They really have their beliefs and stick to it, and sort of asking a lot of questions, focusing on unpacking their sort of beliefs and opinions, and maybe helping them find what you see is wrong, or what you want to confront them about within that. But it's definitely tough when people's emotions come into play, and definitely just remaining calm and trying to be the more rational party in the discussion.
I think even like, I encourage you guys too, like if you've experienced having to talk to a family member or a friend about topics that are kind of like iffy, definitely go ahead, raise your hand or unmute yourself and share. Again, we are not a bank of unlimited knowledge. This is just speaking from our experience. And we really want us to like work as a community and give tips and ideas to each other. I think in the way kind of that we did with this exercise, and making it clear that privilege, like things like privilege and oppression are not mutually exclusive. I feel like when we address certain topics or someone's bias, or a lot of people feel like they're being attacked, their character is being attacked, and that they're, let's say when we talk about privilege, for example, someone could say, oh, well, I don't have privilege because I don't come from a rich family or something like that. And like that's an axis in which like I'm oppressed or I feel oppression because of my class. And so people are very tend to go automatically to something that refutes what you're saying. And so I think really just starting it off as engaging, and even this the little wheel exercise that we did where we asked everybody to just write down the ways in which that they may experience privilege, and having people do that self like reflection, and then also looking at it and now translating it is a good way to start. It doesn't antagonize that person automatically, and at least allows for that free conversation and for people to recognize, at least in the basis, that there are certain things that they haven't experienced. And although they didn't understand how this was relevant or how this was tied to what they felt, it is in fact something that has been ongoing that didn't even recognize. Um, and I think again, encouraging that people be kind to themselves, because it can be brutal to figure these things out. But it's very important.
I just want to just quickly check in with the chat. So somebody recommended the book But I'm Not Racist by Dr. Kathy Obear, and they said that they had some great examples for how to tackle difficult conversations about race with friends, coworkers, and family. So I just want to share that. And we got another question. That's actually a really good question. So who gets to just to say who is right and wrong? In democracy, we use majorities, but they are morally bound to protect the rights of the minority. A flawed methodology, but how do we apply belief and value disagreements in practical life? Like that's
Very
a
hard,
deep
exactly.
one.
I
And
think
I'm not sure. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
in terms of addressing the conversations, like I was mentioning, notice how I didn't say anything about like right or wrong, because that can get very iffy when you oh but you're wrong, and you pull those out, automatically there's going to be a shutdown, like the person's not going to want to continue talking. At least that's been my experience, where if someone's coming at me and attacking me, and already they've decided in their mind that I am wrong, and they're not even at least open to hearing where I'm coming from and doing that work of like unpacking all of that. Um, yeah, it becomes very difficult. And again, what you're mentioning with democracy, and all of that, it's a very sticky situation. I encourage everybody else, like, do you guys have perspectives on this? Like, does everybody, sorry, have perspectives on this? I think this is a tough.
Yeah, I would just like to like also say something about it, because this is like a really interesting one that I'm definitely going to be thinking about for the next couple of days probably. But I just want to say that I feel like identity actually is pretty important in our understanding of politics and equity. When as a Black person, when I encounter people that say racism doesn't exist and will try to argue with me that racism doesn't exist, I'm like, yes, you can believe that because you're white and you haven't experienced it. But in that situation, identity and personal experiences sometimes do disagree with somebody's lived experiences might disagree with people's beliefs. And in that case, it kind of, it does get a bit trickier. But if anybody else has thoughts on this question, yeah, we would love to hear them.
Please, I want to learn. I don't know how to answer it. I'm stumped.
It reminds me of this quote I actually heard, though. I forget who it was by, but it said that if you hurt somebody, you can't tell them that you didn't. It really is sort of a matter of opinion and experience. And I think that in situations where somebody was offended by someone, you can't really say that they're wrong because that was like a feeling. And I feel like that's a debate that comes up a lot in equity, where there's right and wrong.
Yeah, definitely. I think also in terms of a lot of times it's hard when we say speak from our experience. One of the ways that that definitely comes out is when we're talking about the ways in which like the things that we strongly believe in, and a lot of it is because we only understand our experience. Um, And it'd be having opening yourself. Just because you didn't see it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist for someone else. So just in the same way that you may see something, like just in the same way that I may be blind to what you're saying or the experience that you're talking about, know that you could have that same blindness for the things that I'm mentioning. And recognizing that allows us to kind of go into a conversation which doesn't erase each other's experiences, but rather tries to understand and be more constructive. And I think that honestly, that's the best way, but I cannot give you an answer necessarily on like, how can we negotiate the tension in terms of like what we know to be right or what we feel to be right versus what is wrong. That was a very good question to bring up. I think what I would really want to do is to kind of engage in a conversation together about the discussion topics that we had. Let me see if I have the slides. Yes, I do have the slides. So I'll bring those up. Yeah. So
Great.
can everybody see it or am I crazy? Yeah. Okay. Present and hopefully it's. Yeah. So how can we as a community, how can we make our community, our classes, workplace, etc., more inclusive and accessible? So kind of with the understanding and the different topics that we've talked about in your own work or the different things you're engaged in, what do you think is something important from the presentation that you would take away in trying to make your community or the spaces in which you work in more inclusive and accessible to others? And feel free to use the chat
I
function.
see Samantha raised their hand if you want to go.
Hey, I love hearing voices. You know, COVID's very isolating.
Can you guys hear me? Yes, okay. First of all, thank you so much for this discussion. It was very helpful. I really loved it. I feel like the picture of the different people with the like fence in front of them watching the game was really helpful and something that I want to bring into my workplace. I think sometimes people think that that making something inclusive and accessible is like creating diversity, but I feel like sometimes a lot of organizations use the word diversity a little bit empty and don't really like necessarily give meaning to the word diversity or inclusion or accessibility. So I think maybe presenting it to institutions and places where I work as like breaking down barriers might be helpful in a way that I can make the space more accessible and putting it into terms that maybe are more understandable for everybody.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great connection with the sort of different methodology behind equity and what you want to do within your community. Thank you for sharing.
Somebody said, what are some best ways to remove implicit bias towards a community, ethnic groups, and color, sexual orientation, or gender identification?
Like it's harder to split a prejudice than an atom, I guess I believe is what Albert Einstein said. That's definitely very hard, but really it like the only way to really do it is to notice it and to notice it consistently. And it sort of takes a degree of mindfulness and just really listening to your own thoughts. A lot of the time implicit bias doesn't escape our mouths. It's not even the things we say, but the things that we think that influence the things that we say and do, and really putting in the time and energy to look at how we view people and to ask ourselves the hard questions, the uncomfortable questions. As Kat said, I definitely relate to that feeling of sort of shame, noticing implicit bias and noticing it within yourself, but really consciously thinking about it. And yeah, having frequent trainings and discussions definitely as well, Jackie. And Kat, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I think it takes a level of intent. So you definitely need to approach it with whether you know you have implicit bias or not, but just being intentional about unrooting it. If you're, yeah, whatever mindfulness turns up that you do have a certain implicit bias, and most likely, unfortunately, like you probably do. So being intentional about the pursuit. I think also putting yourself in positions where you're able to not test it out, but I find for myself when I'm just sitting and trying to think about my implicit bias, it's really hard to do so. But as I walk outside and I interact with people in my day to day, I tell myself, like, I will have a control and an understanding of the thoughts that are going through my head as I'm speaking to people and engaging with them. So that when there are those thoughts that just seem a little murky to me, I'll be like, oh, okay, maybe this is an implicit bias, you know? And then taking that moment and like trying to go through it. So what are the thoughts attached to this? Why is it in this specific situation that it may have been triggered? And things like this. I think that's definitely a useful way. So that intent. I think informing yourself, education is a big piece. I think in general, more thinking also not only about undoing and unpacking and unlearning things for ourselves, but also in the ways that we engage or want to later on, like be allies and enter communities that we're not necessarily comfortable in per se, but we want to support. I think education is a really big part. And I think also that in this day and age, it's so hard to say, oh, but I just don't know where to go, or I just don't know, like, there's no resources. There's so many resources and educational tools that are out there. And if you're not able to know a starting point, at least, I think, again, being very in a respectful way, just doing research of keywords to be able to find out who you can go to be able to get some of the support, and then continuing this on your own and not necessarily relying always on that group that you're trying to support. Because if you're constantly relying on them to feed that knowledge to you and you're not doing that work on your own, unfortunately, you start to add to their burden in the ways that they're trying to do. And so in that way, you become less of an ally now and just someone that's just constant, even though the intent is to be able to, like, at some point help them and become this great support, but you are becoming a burden on them. So definitely taking ownership of that process for yourself, and also engaging not only yourself but others around you in it, because it's a lot easier to be able to actually have a successful unlearning process, or when you're not the only one that's doing it, or when you're not coming back to other communities where those biases are being fed back to you again. And then it's just a continual cycle of, okay, I learn, I work through these things. Okay, now I'm being exposed again to these things, and I'm literally relearning things I just unlearned. Yeah, sorry for my rant, but basically intent, taking ownership of the process, and yeah, being positive about it, being like and always like having introspection and taking care of yourself through the process.
Great. Yeah. And there aren't really like many scientific ways to get rid of implicit bias, but there is one social science based method that, to be honest, when I first heard, I thought it was kind of crazy, and I didn't personally try it very much, but I want to share because that's because I just thought of it for this question. But a social scientist in Toronto, to fight his implicit bias, anytime he was out and about, just sort of sitting on the subway or, chilling out, he saw a person of color or a marginalized group, he would make an active decision to look at them and think of of things that are the opposite of what they might usually be associated with. So when he saw a Black person, he would make the conscious decision in his head to think of safety and of kindness. And I thought it was a really interesting approach to literally try to change your brain. But it's that's sort of the only real method that I've heard to fight implicit bias.
I really like that. Some comments. Love what Abby, sorry. So I agree, in many big systems, it requires people at the top to make some moves. And also sometimes having frontline workers stand together and not be afraid to ruffle some feathers. Yeah. And use privilege can help encourage action from the top down. Yeah, definitely. Someone said, love what Abby said. Yep. Ongoing and active commitment to social justice, equity is very important. Just doing one workshop isn't enough. We have to take what we learn and apply these values in an everyday life. Yes. Join a book study with coworkers, friends, or family has been helpful for me. Okay. Thank you, Vivian. Um, Great answer. Thank you a lot. And yeah, I like that. Does anybody have anything else they want to mention? Like, how are some other ways, or even if there's been some difficulties that you've encountered? We have about 7 minutes left. Any comments? Anything you would like us to specify or address?
Even comments or feedback, I would love to hear any sort of shocking parts for people or things that people learned or took away from this.
Or even if this is applicable at all to your life. Because maybe we're just ranting on and it's like, okay, I don't really see myself in this, but hopefully you do.
If you don't mind, I'll say a little bit. I come from a background I have 2 Indigenous daughters. And I also come from a background that my grandfather was from South Africa. So I deal with a lot of bias in working with youth. I work with youth, and in dealing with my daughter's Indigenous culture too, I educate myself constantly because I want to know about them as well. So I can't be biased, right? Yeah. And I feel that I work really, really hard, but I appear as a white woman, but my background is South Africa. And people are biased about me too, because they look at me and they go, well, you don't know, right? So I struggle with both of them, both Indigenous and South Africa, my background. Yeah. So with bias and working with youth in the community, I struggle with both.
Thank you for sharing. I feel like that definitely is such a great example of the intersection between identity and some sort of being white passing is something that we didn't really talk about, but that's definitely a really interesting experience to share. Thank you.
I think also in this case, it's very hard if people aren't committed to addressing that bias naturally. It's very hard for people to even engage in changing like their mind if there hasn't been interaction, like a meaningful interaction. So I hope that you talk about all this work that you've done, and like I'm sure that in conversations that you have with people, this knowledge and this work shines through, and so hopefully people in themselves are like understanding that, oh, okay, I had assumptions going into this, and are able to see that kind of work. And I think it can be very difficult, but definitely do not let that dissuade you from that process, and constantly still just holding those core values. It's so hard to shift how people view you or how people choose to see you. And oftentimes when you don't have the opportunity to interact with them, it's even harder. but I really appreciate you sharing your experience. And honestly, I don't really know what advice I can give per se, only to say that I hear you, um, and that I acknowledge the work that you put in.
Thank you very much. And I admire the work that you've put in as well, both you and Samara. I think that that's very important for, like, I have taught my daughter and she went away to university and now she's into her Indigenous culture. And I've tried to teach her to be really like open to every culture and everything like that. She never realized that there was a difference between a Black person and a white person. She always says, you know, that person. So I'm very proud of her for that.
Sorry. Everyone can try and learn a lot of books. Yes, I'm just keeping up. Thank you. As an educator, I've encountered my students, I've encouraged my students to practice responses when confronted with racism, racist thoughts and beliefs. That's really great, and that's very hard to do. But it's so amazing that as an educator and recognizing that you're in that space, that you're making a conscious effort to help your students with that. I know definitely growing up, I would have loved for one of my teachers to recognize the experiences that I was having, even experiences that oftentimes I didn't get based on the age or even just my understanding of the situations. Steve says, interesting. How might we, without genetic testing, determine how anything white other we are? And if we could declare something final column, would it matter? Humans give a lot of value to what we believe we see, which is merely perspective. Yeah, we give a lot of value to what we see, but unfortunately, that has very detrimental repercussions for the people that are being seen, and especially when you don't necessarily have a control of what people choose to see in you. And so although it's very unfortunate in terms of like genetics and all of that, regardless, even if I was to tell you that I'm an 8th Russian, or something, you see me, you perceive me in terms of my racial identity as Black, and the things that you choose to say, the way that you choose to perceive me is going to be based on that thing that you see. And so it's very unfortunate even. And again, like Samara was talking about, we unfortunately didn't have the time to talk about those nuances of like white passing and how some people can like, even given like a certain identity, depending on how passing you are in that identity. And even like, this makes me think also like when we think of trans individuals, depending on how passing they are, certain people will experience more privilege because of how acceptable or how normalized they're seen as being. When you could like ask someone else that is not necessarily as passing, you could be like, we have the same identity. Why, how come they get treated better than I do? And so it's really frustrating. And I'm glad that you mentioned that. And by my,
I just say, so I don't mean to cut you, but it's 7:30.
yeah,
So
sorry.
does anyone have any final comments for Samara or Catherine? I am actually blown away and amazed at the wonderful evening that we've had. And it seems like we could be going on for a couple more hours, but you guys have engaged everyone so nicely. So I really appreciate all your work that you've put in to bringing this workshop for us. So with that being said, I'd like to thank Catherine and Samara for this great workshop that you've done for our volunteers and the members of the community.